the U.S. going to get dragged in?
I think it's likely. I guess the big question is Donald Trump himself. And Trump, again, is a very unpredictable person. And he's capable of reversing himself, of doing 180s. We've seen it happen before. It happened, with the Houthi fight. There were people that were pushing for, let's say, another 4 to 6 months. He said, this is what we need to finish this off. He gave him a month. It didn't work. He called it off. So again, he could reverse himself. I think he may have been tricked, or not necessarily tricked, but he very naively believes that this can be contained and then it can be used to pressure the Iranians, that will bomb them for a few weeks and then bring him back to the negotiating table. I think at least, people who persuaded him to go along with this attack probably made that argument. He say, hey, this is something that can help your negotiations. If in fact he really was sincere about the negotiations at any stage. And in fact, I think that's possible that he certainly was sincere, but he got, was pressured and maybe just argued into doing this and say, this will actually help you because here, see, they're not cooperating. They're not agreeing to do this. We'll bomb the hell out of them. And then, we'll stop and then they'll be back at the negotiating table. Now, I don't see how that's going to work, unfortunately. And then Trump, again, just assuming that Trump ever intended to do anything, other than do this attack, he was pressured into it. The pressure is going to be on him, and it's it's going to grow as this conflict moves forward to intervene, right? Especially if Israel continues to suffer damage from Iranian missile attacks. There's going to be pictures of destroyed buildings. There are going to be civilian casualties. There already have been. Actually, very few. When you consider the number of missiles that were fired and the number of impacts that occurred. But the Israelis are admitting to 3 dead civilians and dozens injured, much less than what Iran has suffered. And of course, the civilian casualties are much, much higher over there. But it's, the West has very little tolerance for Israeli civilian casualties. And I think there's inevitably going to be more, and the pressure will grow. And if it takes a real bad turn and the Israelis find themselves on the ropes, then the pressure is going to be overwhelming for the U.S. to go in. Now, there's just an off chance that there's a chance, that Trump will look at this and just realize, this is heading the wrong way. This is going to hurt me. I had been told that this was limited and could be contained, and that we didn't have to become involved so directly, and the negotiations. None of this is happening, and I don't want to see again American personnel being killed. That just doesn't help with my base. And he may just say, okay, yeah, I'm out of here. We won, just like with the Houthis. Iran is, took a huge blow because of, our awesome support that we gave for Israel. But now let's have a peace treaty. Because the Iranians are begging for it, even if they're not begging for it. You know how Trump talks. You could actually see that outcome. I think that's the best possible outcome that we could hope for. But the pressures to do otherwise, to escalate, to bring in the Americans, and then the chance that this is going to spread and there are going to be attacks on American bases is there. And so yeah, this is a very, very scary situation.
I mean, that seems like the likely outcome. I think I wouldn't bank too much on Trump's reverse gear. I mean, yeah, he has it, but just the rhetoric coming out of him recently has been scary. Just saying, proud of this ruse and saying that like they're all dead, and reminding me of when he tweeted out about us bombing this Houthi tribal gathering. It's like, oops, just very flippant and callous.
Yeah.
it's a scary side to Trump. It doesn't feel like the same Trump that said, I just want to see people stop dying. It seems like he doesn't have that same regard when it comes to Arabs or Iranians.
Enemies of Israel in general. I think that's true.
Right. So what do you think U.S. involvement would look like? How will this start? Will this start with right now it's defensive, but clearly the pressure to go offensive is going to build. What do you think that would look like? Will that be Diego Garcia? Will that be our bases throughout the Persian Gulf? How does this work?
It probably would be Diego Garcia. The problem with the Persian Gulf bases, obviously they're much closer. Of course, that makes an attack easier, but then it also makes retaliation, certain and very easy for the Iranians. Those bases are very, very close to Iran. And they can immediately, really destroy them, and kill a lot of the personnel and destroy a lot of the aircraft that are on the ground there. And I think the Americans are very much aware of that. And then I think also there is a problem again with the Gulf states. I'm sure they do not want their airspace used, and the bases there, for an attack on Iran, because they can suffer the consequences too. They understand that. And, they have all actually condemned this attack by Israel. They did not want this to happen. So I don't think you're going to get the cooperation among those Gulf states. And you're also just going to be, the fact of their vulnerability is going to, is going to force the United States to use bases farther away, namely Diego Garcia. Now, that's a long ways away. We're talking about something like 5,000 kilometers, I believe it is. It's a long, long ways away. Of course, these strategic bombers, they can travel those distances. But then, if Iran still has its air defense, those bombers are going to be very, very vulnerable, and there's going to be a chance that one or more of them are going to be brought down. And then even those bombers, though that they can carry these very, very large bunker buster bombs, they still can't. Everybody seems to agree that they would not be able to destroy the most deeply buried Iranian nuclear facilities. It's just they don't even have enough bombers to pull it off. I mean, there's theoretically, I can't remember what it is, if you drop 20 of these bombs or something, in succession, you could do it. But they don't even have a fleet that's capable of carrying that many bombs and pulling that off with a conventional. The only way you could do it is with a nuclear device. And, I hope to God that doesn't happen. I'm assuming that nobody's really thinking about that seriously now. And the scary thing is just with any kind of war, and a war again, when you have what's happening in Gaza is a horror, of course, it's a genocide, but essentially the Gazans really can't fight back. So it's a horror that we're observing, it's the destruction of these people. But there really isn't a risk of it, spiraling out of control right there. The Israelis are in command, they just inevitably will succeed in their objectives if they, stick with it and they continue to be supported by the United States. But when you're fighting a peer or near peer adversary, you don't have that same kind of control. They just say that, I don't know who, maybe it was Clausewitz, it's just like all your battle plans never survive the first day of battle. It's just like once, because the enemy always has a say. That's the thing in what you do, and so once you begin a war, you're going to find yourself faced with choices that you never really had entertained, and doing things that you thought that you would never do, because there's just a logic of war that forces you, to as your position grows more desperate, to take extreme measures, and then of course that causes the enemy to do the same. We can this is and that's, I think, that what we've seen again, that Iran can fight back, so that if this could go anywhere. It's going to be very, very difficult to contain. It's a little bit like, again, just setting a fire in a grassland, in a prairie. And, the plan was to put it out after it burned 2 acres. But the wind picks up and it's, it starts to burn rapidly in every direction. And I think there's a real chance. It's a real chance that that's going to happen in this case.
Okay. Yeah, are you able to tell us, what has Israel done so far in Iran, and what is sort of the future of their attacks looking like, or currently looking like? I know you don't know their plans, but it seems like they had that initial surprise, and now how's it going? And what would you do if you were in charge of the Israeli army, the Air Force, or whatever?
Well, I wouldn't be in charge of I would call it off. I mean,
I know. Obviously, that's the logical thing. But right. if you're blocking this war and you feel like you have to win it, then what is it that you think that Israel would try to do?
Yeah. Well, okay. Well, first of all, after the initial surprise, that involved waves of attacks and went on for hours and hours, that really has died down. The Iranians responded very forcefully with 5 waves of missile attacks that struck, again, in headquarters, military headquarters, intelligence headquarters, and apparently a nuclear research facility, military bases, up and down, all across Israel. And then the Israelis responded, but it doesn't seem to be their response was nothing like the initial, surprise attack. Now, there's some reasons for that. I think that they are limited in what they can do by the aircraft that they have, and particularly the F-35, which they've become to rely on. The F-35 is a very fragile machine. And for every hour of flight time, on average, it requires 12 hours of maintenance. So those F-35s that were used in the initial attack are probably still undergoing maintenance now, because they require, this is 3 hours. I think that, an operation that takes you close to Iranian airspace or into Iranian airspace and back is going to use up about 3 hours of flight time. Therefore, we're talking about something like 36 hours of maintenance. So, they are limited. They can't keep up the tempo because of that. I think for F-15s or F-16s, it's something like 5 hours. So, they got 15 hours of maintenance. That's not nearly as bad. So they did hit with the second wave, but it doesn't seem to have done. Maybe it's just that we don't have pictures. There were reports that there were attacks on the ports in the south of Iran. There were more attacks I believe, in Tehran and surrounding cities. One residential building was hit and killed 60 civilians. I don't know what that was. If it was a deliberate attack, probably not. But it may have been just a missile that missed its target or that had been deflected by air defense. So right now there appears to be a lull. Again, the Iranians responded forcefully. The Israelis retaliated against the Iranian retaliation, but not nearly as forcefully as they did at the beginning. And I believe that there's maybe one other volley of Iranian missiles, and then nothing seems to be happening right now. I think the Iranians they're trying not to go up the escalation ladder too fast, but they are responding if the Israelis do this. Now, I guess looking according to the Israeli logic is, okay, we want to escalate. So they're going to continue to look for provocative, high-value targets. And, they won't be able to score the successes that they did on the first surprise attack because, of course, they had the advantage of surprise, and they had those assets on the ground within Iran. Apparently, a number of those vehicles that were carrying the drones have been captured by the Iranians now, and they say that they also have captured a number of Mossad agents or their collaborators. But I think a lot of it comes down to how much damage was done to the air defense. Clearly, some was done, without a question. And especially in those first hours, you just didn't see any interceptions. It seemed like they were just the Iranians were naked. They were completely vulnerable. But my understanding is now that the air defense system seem to be coming back online, and they're having more success in bringing down Israeli missiles. So again, if you say the Israeli logic is to escalate, and they'll keep on, looking for holes, looking for, if they still have this in the intelligence networks on the ground, they're going to continue these decapitation strikes, which of course they're highly provocative and greatly, anger the Iranians, and this will, lead to more missile strikes on Israel, and then hopefully, the Israelis, the logic is it's a really quite a brutal kind of logic, but I think this is Netanyahu's logic. It's just like the more smoking ruins in Tel Aviv, the more reports of dead civilians, the more likely that the U.S. will be brought in. And how do we make that happen? Is by, very, provocative strikes on the Iranian side.
Right. So I think it's clear to anybody that's following this conflict honestly that they know that the goal for Israel is to draw on the United States. They can't even do what they're doing now without U.S. support. I mean, if they're flying the planes, I imagine we were doing the air refueling in this attack. We say we had nothing involved, but I'm not sure if Israel could make that flight without the help of some of our air refueling tankers.
Right. I think they have at least one or a couple of air refueling tankers, but they had 200 aircraft, and I know in past attacks they've relied on the U.S. So unless they acquired a number of tankers in the last several months, they surely are dependent on the U.S. I think probably they are. I haven't heard anything definite one way or another on that.
Right. I mean, so the only hope for Israel is that if the U.S. comes in full force and it's existential for them, they're going to do whatever they can to bring in the United States. Right now, they have a huge problem, though, because there is no support for war with Iran in the United States right now. We weren't really buttered up for this war like with the Iraq war. We're a little bit more savvy. People understand something's going on. And Trump was elected to say no more wars. And all of a sudden it's like, oh, Iran's got nuclear weapons. We got to bomb. Israel's bombing them right now. Forget the negotiations. It's over. War with Iran. Everybody get on board with war with Iran. I think a lot of people are like, whoa, this isn't what I signed up for. I don't like this at all. So this is what makes me think that we are heading for a false flag type event, that this is what I'm afraid of. Because when I spent a lot of time watching the news yesterday live, Fox and CNN, and one thing that I saw reoccurring with all the guests that they had on, they were saying, oh, okay, well, Israel's military power is incredible, amazing, and we see what they did in this decapitation strike, and their air defense system is so good. Iran will have to resort to asymmetric warfare. That's what we have to watch out for. Watch out for terrorist cells that are scattered throughout the world, not just around Israel or America. They have their proxy. Iranian is the terror regime, and they will activate these terror cells, and we'll see terror attacks. That's what I saw again and again. And I just feel like, and I see Zionist Twitter pages as well, accounts, is saying, like, watch out for false flag attacks. And it just makes me think that that's the only thing they can do. They're in this situation where they have to generate manufacturer consent. And how do you do that? Say Iran, blows up something, kills a bunch of civilians at some rally or protest or something in the United States or around the world. I mean, there's already some fishy things. I think you saw the news about two Minnesota lawmakers that were assassinated, and there's some big fire. Now that's the problem, though. Once I see anything on the news, I'm like, oh, Mossad. That's Mossad too. So I don't know, but I'm on edge for that. What do you think is the likelihood of some type of false flag?
Well, it's there. And again, of course, Israel has a history of using false flags. It's some of the two most famous false flag events in recent military history. There was the Lavon affair in Egypt, and then the USS Liberty. I think it's pretty certain that was a false flag, and a very major one. It was an attempted false flag. Let's put it that way. So yeah, there's a chance of it, and especially if they start to sense that a real reluctance on the part of Trump. He starts to look. It's like, oh God, this really isn't working out very well. My base is kind of mad at me. This is, I think we should just call it quits now and declare victory or something. And he starts really, making these statements, and you could see him doing something like that. I mean, that's potentially, what what will occur. Yeah, again, it's just like the Israelis have gone way out on a limb here, Netanyahu in particular, and I don't think he's going to crawl back. He's going to. What can he do? It may be this already is a very, very reckless act, and so if they, and we've seen a lot of reckless acts and really, frankly, very extreme, acts that is just completely disregard, all norms of war, and we've seen those over the last several months. What is going to prevent them from doing that if they think they can pull it off?
Yeah, I'm worried. I feel like that's if I put my shoes in Israel.
Oh, no, you put your
put myself in Israel's shoes.
Yeah,
it's just that I just don't see any other way out of it. You have to get the U.S. involved. That's your only chance. And so if you don't have that groundswell support, you have to manufacture it. How do you manufacture it? Has to be a false flag, or they have to go to a nuclear level. And so, and the longer that this war drags on, I think we know that if we're entering in some type of attrition war between Iran and Israel, it seems like Iran definitely has the advantage. I saw a news report that China is backing Iran through supplying what it needs to make these ballistic missiles. And I've seen the news that maybe you can verify this, that 2 F-35s have been shot down, or 1 F-35, 1 F-16. And there was even a F-35 pilot that was captured.
Okay, yeah, there are reports. They're not official reports, to my knowledge. At least the most recent one was unofficial, that actually 3 planes were shot down and 2 pilots were captured. I don't know. The Israelis deny it, and this is something that clearly we'll find out one way or another. If the Iranians in fact have 1 or more of these pilots, then they're going to show them. They're going to appear in front of the television cameras, in the near future, within the next few hours, or at the very most, within the next couple of days, I would think. And if we don't see it, then we know that those reports in Iran were false. Right now we just have to say that it's not confirmed.
This war between Israel and Iran is so different than what we see in the Ukraine. In the Ukraine, we have 2 armies that are side by side, a long front line. We have trenches and artillery shells. We've even had footage of hand-to-hand combat. With Israel and Iran, they're over 1,000 miles apart, and it's this long-range warfare. Do you think that's a more dangerous situation because the only options you have are essentially escalating with larger and larger, ballistic missiles or ICBMs or whatever it is you have?
Yeah. Well, I guess in one way it's, it makes it more difficult to achieve a decisive victory, because in the end you really have to have the troops on the ground to really conquer another country. I think that has to be said. Again, we can see that Russia's missile war has wreaked a great deal of damage throughout Ukraine. It's been, very effective in achieving its objectives, but warfare has shown us that this war and in past wars, victory is never achieved through the air. Bombing has a very important role, but it's essentially a support role. It's that the battles, the real battles, and the final, victory can only be achieved, or the battles can only be decided by ground forces, again with air support. So what we have here is, I think it becomes impossible actually for either side to achieve a total victory over the other side. But eventually, again, if the U.S. doesn't become involved, if somehow, the Iranians are very restrained, very careful, and do not provoke the U.S., are careful to avoid the targets. And then Trump himself, again, is truly reluctant to bring the U.S. in directly. And he actually holds his ground. I wouldn't depend on that, but he just might. Okay, so we have just a war between Israel and Iran. If that war goes ahead, that eventually it's going to, I think we're going to, not have a total victory, but we're going to have maybe reach a state of exhaustion. And I think that state of exhaustion is going to happen first in Israel, because I think that they have less capacity. They have fewer missiles to begin with, my understanding, and they don't have the productive capacity to replace the missiles they're using. Their air defense eventually will be, all their interceptors will be depleted. And Iran will still be standing. I mean, Israel will still be standing, but it'll be greatly weakened. And it will start to experience increasing pain. Let's say as it just becomes easier and easier for Iran to penetrate Israel's airspace and hit its targets. Now, this could go on and on. Israel could still be supplied by the U.S. It'll stand. It won't be utterly defeated, but it'll become very painful. And and so if it comes down to the U.S. If you have a president that has decided, he was going to support this attack, but no, the U.S. is not going to become involved. He finally decides that this just isn't working, and he pressures Israel to call it quits, to ask for a ceasefire. They'll have to do it, because there's just, the only reason that they can still stand and, still be in the fight in some sense is because the U.S. is there. Maybe supplying them with insufficient missiles, but still missiles, still supplying with economic aid, et cetera, et cetera. They'll still be there. But if the U.S. says no, they'll have to call it quits. I guess this is what we always hope for, but it never really happens, But that's what I can say. Now, things change. Well, even if the U.S. becomes involved, B-2 bombers start dropping big bombs, they still. Iran's a big country, and they know they've been attacked. Now, right now, there's a great deal of anger. The anger is not directed at their own government. Their anger, of course, is quite naturally directed, first of all at Israel, and then second at the U.S. If the U.S. becomes involved, it's just they know who's been attacking them, who's in the past and in the present, and in the end, you really cannot defeat them. You cannot defeat a country just through the air. They will still be in the fight. It's going to, at some point, the U.S. is going to have to, or Israel is going to say, well, this just isn't working, or we can't do it. And again, maybe in true Trumpian fashion, declare victory and go home. But after a great deal of destruction has been wrought. And then, again, this is like one of the rosier scenarios that I'm painting. It's a possibility. But then there's always a chance, again, of it spreading to, to certainly if the U.S. becomes involved to military bases, but then attacks on economic, infrastructure, on attacks on oil refineries, the closing of the Strait of Hormuz. There are all these things that become a possibility if this goes on too long, and then the situation becomes, dire for both sides.